Hey everybody, and welcome back to another edition of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish. I'm your host, Grant Pemberton, and today we're joined by revivalist, author, physicist, and one of the best teachers that I've ever been able to hear from, Putty Putman. He is the author of a couple of books, Live Like Jesus and Kingdom Impact, and is the head of a global movement, School of Kingdom Ministry, that trains and disciples over 200 different churches and 7,500 different students remotely. You were ahead of the curve of the COVID impact, Putty, and was able to do all this school remotely. And it's such an honor having you here. And I may have glossed over it. You may have not heard it correctly, but I did say physicist also, that you actually graduated, I guess, from school with physics. I don't even know what to do. What is a physicist? What you got a physics class?
Yeah, so to be a little more precise, yes, I do have a PhD in physics. I studied theoretical quantum physics here at University of Illinois, and it was kind of in the process of that I ran into the Holy Spirit. Turns out he's a little bigger deal than I had realized, and eventually that was what kind of directed me into ministry vocationally. But I did complete the PhD, did a year as a postdoc. Loved my time in physics, actually. It was just totally great, but couldn't do both.
So Putty, I'm just going to jump in here to clarify for the sake of everyone who's listening to this podcast. And I'm going to be a little bit tongue in cheek here too, but there's a lot of people out there, including many friends that you and I have in common, who like to talk about physics and God and quantum glory and this, that, and the other. And everyone's trying to, find the unified field theory, which for those who don't know, is a specific term within the discipline of physics.
Yep.
But they're looking for the unified field theory as it pertains to God and physics. But the thing that always amazes me is the people who teach on this aren't actual physicists. So did I hear you say that you are a real, live, honest to God, living, breathing, degreed physicist from a legitimate institution?
Yes.
You did say that.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So if we were to ask you, say, questions about how the quantum field theory works with regard to, say, the glory of God or other matters that you have learned about in the midst of your theological journeys, you would be a qualified expert to give opinions on these things.
Probably by most people's considerations, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And
I would say I can speak to that with expertise. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I figure if you have a postdoctorate in it, that would be a pretty good indicator. And did you ever actually work in any, whether a research, teaching, or industry job or government job? I guess that would be a fourth category.
Mm-hmm.
Using the expertise you have.
I did work for the government. I worked at Argonne National Laboratory, not directly with that expertise though.
Okay.
The way it timed out was it wasn't that long after I got my PhD that the Lord kind of called me directly into ministry. So I definitely could have. I had a great career, just didn't time out that way.
Yeah.
But with respect to my training, actually at University of Illinois, which is a top 10 physics program in the nation, if not globally. It's actually number one in the world in a category called solid state physics, which is related to quantum physics.
That was what I went to Princeton to study.
Really?
Yeah, and God interrupted me. Yeah, no, God interrupted me, but I went to Princeton to study solid state physics.
No kidding. Oh, that's so cool. I didn't know that. Totally fun. In the year of my PhD program, actually, from what I could discern, they didn't actually tabulate this, but you could sort of like piece it together. I actually believe that from what I could discern, I think I was the most awarded student in terms of research awards and teaching capability awards and stuff. I got a number of really, really good things. So I was doing great. Let's just put it that way. I was doing great, and the Lord called me into ministry instead. So yeah. So let's talk about it. Let's go there. Let's have
Let's do that.
Educated conversation about this topic. I would love that.
For the record, I made a D in chemistry in high school, so you two seem to have a lot on here. So I think I'm just gonna add in some, that sounds cool, that sort of stuff. So I'll let you guys take it away.
For sure.
All right. Well, Putty, so since we have a qualified physicist in our presence, why don't you give us the layman's short version, maybe 3 minutes or less, of what do we mean when we say quantum physics or the quantum, and what are we talking about when we say words like the unified field theory? What's going on with that, so that everyone's at least starting with the same basic understanding? And obviously you have far more depth than anyone else on this program, or probably even listening to this program, but I just want to have everybody speaking the same common language as we go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So quantum physics refers to a branch of physics that began to be founded in the early 20th century as experiments that began to kind of probe the structure and the behavior of the atom, began to produce very strange and unexpected results. The field of physics before discovering relativity and quantum physics was very well defined, very well understood. And in fact, some very famous physicists at the close of the 19th century, in the late 1800s, they said basically physics is done. It's just a matter of dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And so everything seemed really, really well understood. And then they started doing some experiments that indicated that atoms didn't behave at all like people were expecting in the slightest. It was very confusing. It was very strange. And the only way that people could make sense of it was to essentially postulate that the way atoms work and the way the world of the very, very, very small works is pretty substantially different from the way that the world that we kind of see and can touch and can interact with physically. It seems to follow very, very different rules. And those rules are called quantum mechanics. Mechanics being, describing the sort of internal workings of. And the term quantum refers to something being quantized, which means being discrete. And one of the things particularly that's very interesting about quantum mechanics is there are many things that are continuous in our everyday experience. Speed is a continuous thing. You can travel at any speed, like not 1 mile or 2 miles or 3 miles an hour. You can go 1.5 and 1 3/4 and whatever. There's a continuous thing there. But when you get to the atoms, a lot of the behavior gets confusing because many of the middles vanish and things become discrete. Like you can be moving at 1 or 2 or 3, but not anything in between. And similarly with position and location, all kinds of interesting things. And that happens because it turns out that once you get below a certain kind of threshold of probing, you get small enough, the rules of the world are super weird. It turns out things act as both particles and waves at the same time. And that wave-like behavior is what produces these sort of quantized results. The world is just super weird down there. Like, in our everyday, if you want to go from here to there, like there's one path you travel. In quantum mechanics, weird things happen where particle going from A to B actually travels all possible paths between them, not just one, every single one that's possible at the same time. So the world just works like totally super weird and strange. And this develops into a whole theory that's called quantum theory, quantum physics, quantum theory, quantum mechanics. And at first, all of that is just aimed at understanding like atoms themselves. How do the electrons fly around the nucleus and all that. But as the probing continues, there's kind of this new version of quantum mechanics that gets called quantum field theory. We're heading towards unified field theory, you can probably hear. And the idea of a quantum field theory is to imagine that you have quantum systems, an infinite number of them that live at every point in space and time. And you probe and you ask how they interact and how they talk with one another. And it turns out that when you do that, you can unlock understanding of a whole lot more layers of things. You can understand how nucleuses inside of atoms interact. You can understand how light interacts and interesting things that it does. And we actually have lasers because of all of that. We have computers because of all of that. Solid state physics comes out of that, which gives us transistors, which give us computers. And so quantum field theory then becomes kind of the next iteration, and that develops into a few different areas. And we have a study of quantum electromagnetics, called QED sometimes, quantum electrodynamics. That's basically quantum mechanics of light, which produces lasers, etc. You have quantum chromodynamics, which is connected to all of the stuff, the inner workings of protons and neutrons. You've got quarks and gluons and all that kind of stuff. That's actually where much of my study was connected to QCD there. Then you've got some weird things, other things. There's something called the weak force that comes up, which has to do with decay inside of atoms and stuff, and that gets connected to electromagnetics, and so you get kind of this weird joint theory that happens there. And all of this, as people study it, seems like it's sort of converging down to a sort of core understanding that looks like it can explain just about everything that we could imagine. But the one place where things don't play nicely is when it comes to wrestling with gravity and how that works. And specifically what happened is Einstein messed gravity up when he described it through what's called general relativity. And it turns out that the mechanics and the mathematics of general relativity and the mechanics of and mathematics of quantum mechanics and quantum field theory and all of these, like, there is no discernible way to put them together. They just blow up when you try and get them close to one another. And this is the kind of thing that physicists just can't handle. They're like, no, I'm supposed to be able to describe everything, but I can describe everything that's really small and everything that's really big, but I can't get them to touch each other. It just, everything blows up, everything is catastrophic. And so the search for how to integrate those is what's called a unified field theory, the idea of a field theory that describes all the behavior of electrodynamics, quantum chromodynamics, the weak force, and gravity together. That would be the sort of holy grail of physics. Everything that we can measure, we can understand as coming out of this one singular theory. And there's been a lot of work on it. I mean, goodness, even Einstein was really the one who picked that up and said, we got to figure out how to do this. Like back in like the 30s and 40s, he was working on this. And so it's been a lot of work between now and then. And there's some different interesting ideas. String theory has been proposed and some others. But it is a really open problem, not by any means solved. And we'll see what continues to happen.
Thanks for that overview. That's really helpful. Although I know for a lot of people, it will be spinning their heads around because they've never really heard this kind of talk before. And I actually think that it's important that we do this because, you never really want somebody who's an amateur to give you input on any subject matter. And sometimes some subject matter takes longer to develop expertise than others. You clearly have that expertise in physics. So with that, let's transition here. One of the things that's really popular in the glory streams of the church, and there are many movements that are kind of trending this way. If you go looking for it on YouTube, you can find it. It deals with things like light, sound, music, and how all this relates to quantum mechanics. And when I listen to it as somebody who studied some physics, at the collegiate level at a reputable institution, most of it doesn't really hold a lot of water for me because it sounds good, but upon closer examination, it may not bear scrutiny.
Sure.
I'd like to get your take on all of that as somebody who is a full-on legitimate physicist. And you are somebody who moves in the spirit as well. You pray for the sick. You see miraculous things. You may not be a musician yourself, but you've got a band that travels with you. Your brother's a musician. I would love to hear your thoughts on sound, light, music, and what does this show us about God?
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And there's kind of a series of topics in here. So I'll just kind of talk about some of them and feel free to steer me here. I'm familiar with definitely some of the type of content that you're talking about. And it really has been, I don't know, the last half dozen or so years where it seems there's been kind of a flourishing of this type of conversation. Here's what I'll say. I believe that there are many people who are excited and entirely mean well, but most of what I have read here from my point of view is rather nonsensical, if I'm going to be transparent. So here's the thing, right? Like, if you are not a trained scientist, then it's very easy to make connections of things that are scientific knowledge and things that are spiritual knowledge, and think that something that looks similar from one to the other means that science is informing our spiritual knowledge somehow. And like, I understand all of that. Like, that's all, sure, I can get how you would get there. But science is a algorithmically defined discipline, meaning like science exists because there are theories that are constructed, which you then test with experiments, and then that feeds you back into refining of your theory. And there's this sort of cycle, what we call, the scientific method, which results in a body of knowledge. If you take the findings of that body of knowledge, the theory, and you say, well, this theory looks like this other thing over here, but you don't do experimental things that link the two, like, you are not doing science. I just want to be clear on that. Like, you're not doing science. You may be doing science-inspired philosophy. Now that may be that, and I'm not saying that that's bad. Like, if you want to do science-inspired, like, science has always inspired philosophy. That's fine. But there's a difference between taking some aspects of, say, scientific theory and noticing some similarities between that and, say, supernatural events or biblical accounts or something like that, and then putting the two of them together like this. Like, that is kind of a disciplinary violation, if that makes sense. Like, you're crossing the boundaries of two well-defined disciplines and bringing them together in a way that just, like, really doesn't ultimately make a lot of sense.
So just to interject for a moment and to throw a theological concept at this is analogous to, but not identically the same as, when Jesus says, if I don't do the works of my Father, don't pay any attention to what I'm saying. He's backing up what he says with what he does.
Sure.
And with science, if you have a theory, somebody's got to be able to test it out and check to make sure that it's right.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Precisely. And, I think what happens is we've got people who learn some elements of quantum theory or something like that, and that's great, and that's really cool. And then observe some parallels. I'll just grab one. Like, in quantum mechanics, it's not unheard of. It's actually rather common for particles to teleport through walls or cross barriers or whatever. Things that in classical physics are impossible happens in quantum mechanics all the time. So it's easy to read something like that and go, oh, well, that must be how Jesus walked through a wall, or, oh, that's how, Philip teleported to Azotus or whatever. And like, to make that statement, in my opinion, is odd in a number of levels. So the first is this: the whole point of quantum mechanics is that the world of the very small does not behave the way the world of the very big is. And what you just did was you took the world of the very small and you said it behaves the same as the world of the very big. And like, so you've actually already left quantum mechanics behind when you say, I bet a person could do that too. Like, you're no longer in the realm of quantum mechanics in that space, because quantum mechanics is defined by a certain scale, which is the size of an atom, not the size of a person. So you've kind of like broken things in terms of the scientific regard. And in fact, I would even say this: like, is it possible that quantum mechanics could result in the teleportation of a person? Yes, but what I would say is that would be such a more significant miracle than the like typical way that we just understand that as a straight miracle. Like the possibilities of that happening are the kinds of thing that it's impossible. It would never happen, if that makes sense.
it would be more miraculous for the theories involved in quantum mechanics to apply to Jesus walking through a wall than Jesus walking through a wall miraculously through the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what it feels like. It feels like it would be so hard. Like it would be just a ridiculous miracle for God to do it that way.
Yeah.
But I think even the problem that goes beyond that, which I think is just so important for us as practitioners of Holy Spirit ministry, is this. If I explain supernatural phenomenon through quantum physics, then I am saying it's not supernatural.
Right.
I'm saying it's really fancy, unexpected natural, but it's not supernatural. It doesn't transcend the order of creation. It is included and unexpected within the order of creation. And I think that that's a really important point that I've not heard people who are having this conversation really wrestle with. Like, okay, you want to say that all these miracles happen through quantum mechanics? Well, then we can't really actually call them a miracle anymore, probably.
I mean, it's the same thing that cessationists will try to do to explain miracles, or even agnostics, or try to explain, how the Red Sea was actually parted because it was like, the dry season or whatever. It's like,
Sure.
Yeah, it's the same concept, which makes no sense from a charismatic standpoint. It's like,
Right.
trying to look for that.
Right. And this is the general problem that I have with just the whole approach to the whole conversation, which is this. Quantum mechanics describes some rules that help us understand this order of creation. And God is not limited or bounded by this order of creation. So if we take those rules and try and map them onto God and understand God through those rules, we've done it backwards. The idea is that like God kind of reaches into this creation, but he's not limited by it. And so his intersection with this creation ought to disrupt the rules of this creation. It ought to kind of shift and break and make things unexpected and unexplainable and whatever. And so if we try to take these rules and reach them back up towards God, like you're going to wind up in a weird place. Like that's not how the biblical story, I mean, like really it's actually perhaps a form of like panentheism. Like if we really look at it, which is that like God is creation. Like if I'm taking the rules of creation and mapping them upward to understand God, I'm saying God doesn't transcend creation, which is, as far as I know, pretty thoroughly the biblical worldview. And so, I know like I'm kind of knocking on this a little bit, and some of that is because I can kind of see it from the viewpoint of an expert. I will say that I do think there are some cool things that we can learn from quantum mechanics, and there are some analogies or parallels from quantum mechanics that can teach us some things about God. I think framing it that way is a fair way to frame it, but you have to be clear. You're saying this is an analogy. You're not trying to make some sort of equivocation or some direct connection, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And I think, being able to find God in creation is awesome. But to literally find God in creation is, again, what you were saying, that's pantheism. And so God has to be outside of the order.
Mm-hmm.
He created it. And so it's neat that, quantum mechanics has some pretty cool things about it that are like, wow, that's cool. But it certainly doesn't constitute, this is how God does miracles.
So, Putty, I want to just drill into something you said, because it's so important that we would be remiss not to dwell on it for a moment. You used the term panentheism, and then Grant just now used the term pantheism. They're actually not the same thing, but people often mistake them. I have taught on this before, and one of my gravest fears, in fact, I preached a sermon on this past Sunday at Paytonsville Church, which is Larry Randolph's church, on the primacy and supremacy of God. I did not use those terms, though. I could have. I just opted not to, given the audience. But since we're on this podcast and these terms are now, in the air and the water, Why don't you unpack for us a little bit what panentheism is in a little more detail, unpack what pantheism is, and then why don't you explain why both of these are heresy from the Christian standpoint? Because these things are invading our modern Christian vocabulary, thought process. And I really fear, as Paul the Apostle said, that many are being drawn away from the simplicity of pure-hearted devotion to Christ, and they're actually drinking from a poisoned well. And what I've learned experientially in my own ministry is that bad theology leads to very bad outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, so I'll give my best here. And Ken, I know you're back and forth on the phone. So truthfully, I feel like you could probably do this with precision better than I can. And I may have used the wrong one there. So if you're you're trying to correct me on this, well played. But here, let me do the right one here. If you were watching the video, if there is a video, you may have noticed I kind of sighed because I was like, oh no, am I going to use the right one or the wrong one? I crisscross these. So pantheism, let's see here, at least according to Oxford Dictionary here, the doctrine which identifies God with the universe or regards the universe as a manifestation of God. That would be pantheism. And panentheism is close, but not precisely the same. Panentheism is a word, considers God and the world to be interrelated, with the world being in God and God being in the world. I think maybe one of the key things, and Grant, you can probably speak to this a little as well, perhaps.
I'm enjoying watching this. This is
Ken is just like, I'm gonna make you squirm and get back on the phone.
Correctly. So
all right.
If this is wrong, it'll be me.
Here's the key thing really about both of these ideas that I think are really important for us to know. Both of these ideas fail at the point of there is too strong an identification of the natural order and God himself. And it views God as in and among, but not transcendent over creation. And so, it's kind of like this idea that like God is, sure, maybe he's the biggest thing of creation. Maybe in a way, God is sort of all of creation itself. But it doesn't go to the point of the Hebraic understanding, which is that like, and there are parts of God that aren't manifest in creation directly. Like if you draw a Venn diagram, like there's parts of like God is bigger than the circle of creation. There's parts of God that are out here. And what pantheism and panentheism do is they like identify those circles and they say God and creation are kind of like piled on top of one another, and one is sort of a manifestation of the other in one way, shape, or form. Now, I think the difference between these two, and Ken could probably help here once he gets off the phone if he does. My understanding is pantheism kind of tends to see that play out with the idea of the spiritualizing of creation kind of in a more direct way. And so it's like, oh, God's in that tree and we should worship the tree. God's in that rock. God's in that stream, and like, okay, like I suppose like by some definition of the phrase God's in that tree, like from a Christian point of view, well, God's in all of the universe. So yes, there's an element of God in that tree. But the idea, like there's a tighter identification where it's almost like God is in that tree and that tree ought to be known by the fact that God is in it. And so it gets very, very near and often leads into forms of nature worship and things like this, which is not the way that the Bible portrays our relationship with nature should be. No. It is true that the Bible does indicate there are elements of nature that somehow interact spiritually. The rocks will cry out, the heavens declare the glory of God. So like there's something happening there, but what's not happening there is that we know God through that tree, and therefore we ought to worship the tree. That's generally my understanding of how pantheism works.
Yeah.
Now, my understanding of panentheism is that it is a little different, and Ken, feel free if you're able to correct here at any point. But my understanding with panentheism is more that it wouldn't necessarily drill down to the specific, but it would identify God with the universe as a whole. And so it's like we worship the universe because the universe is God. And, it's the universe that teaches us about God. And so pantheism makes that concrete and tangible, like that thing is God. Panentheism says the whole is God, if that makes sense.
And pantheism says that God is discovering himself through the, we could say the evolution, but it isn't directly tied to the theory of evolution as Darwin taught it. But panentheism says God is discovering himself through the unpacking or the evolution of the manifested order. And so the classical language of Christian theology is what we call the transcendent and the immanent, not imminent like about to happen. It's spelled differently and it means something different, but it's a synonym. It sounds the same. So the transcendent is that supernatural, otherworldly dimension of God, and the immanent is when God shows himself in creation. So panentheism holds the idea that the immanence of God and the transcendence of God are merging. Mm-hmm. Whereas classical theology understands that while God can do both and be both, we understand them a little bit differently because they are different. Pantheism is a particularly important concept backing up to that one that you took on first, because it undergirds all of the monist or all is one theology of Hinduism, Buddhism, and most of the Eastern religions.
Right.
And so part of why I'm so alarmed by what I'm seeing go on in this theological trend, and I would add, as much as we like to think that the renewal streams are where, things are strong and good in Christianity, and, the liberals who deny the deity of Christ or the resurrection, they've kind of lost the plot. I would say in some ways, some of the charismatic streams have lost the plot because we are verging into monism, into pantheism, into panentheism. And this gets reflected through all of this sort of quasi-theologizing that's rooted in language about quantum mechanics, which itself, it may not even be right. So I just said probably 4 volumes of stuff there in a summary form. But part of why I wanted to have this conversation with you is because you are uniquely qualified to address this as somebody who has proper physics training.
Right.
So with that, I'm gonna ask another question of you, which is, how do you understand what we see? And you started to address it, by the way, so I heard that. But how do we see the glory of God, that transcendent dimension of God? How do we understand that? And alongside of what you have as a physicist, Isaac Newton was a man of faith, but he wasn't doing quantum physics. So how does that work for you? What does that mean for you?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. For me, I think the key thing is understanding what my expectations from science should be. And, science is fundamentally something that is limited to understanding the natural order of things. And that's why, as I said, it concerns me when we try and take science and project it to understanding God, because then we're saying God can be understood within the natural order of things, which then leads us to the pantheism, panentheism stuff. The way I always conceived of it when I was in the discipline was this. Science is looking at the fingerprints of God that he left on creation when he made it. I think that's a wonderful way to look at it. You're not seeing God directly. You're seeing his fingerprints. You're seeing the fact that the way he makes things is coherent and is consistent with who he is. And so you will see elements, signs that point to him. You will see things that remind you of him. And there are some fascinating, really interesting parallels. I think, once you start studying quantum chromodynamics, which is the sort of theory behind protons and neutrons and nuclei and all of that, you wind up discovering that protons and neutrons are this ridiculous parallel to the way the Trinity works, where you have three constituent things that live in, quarks that live within these things, which are identifiably different and yet cannot be separated from one another. It's fascinating when you look at it and you go, that is so Trinitarian. It's crazy, right? So you see the fingerprints. And I think that studying and understanding them as fingerprints is awesome and is so valuable and is so beautiful. But once again, we make a mistake when we turn the fingerprints into the identification. And, in general, biblically, we have this idea of general revelation and specific revelation, right? General revelation being the idea that, like, the order in the way of things can point us to the fact that there is a creator, and that's fantastic and that's wonderful. And God's grace has provided general revelation. And I think, back in the day when Paul was writing about these things, I don't think he knew that general revelation would one day be revealed in quantum mechanics as well. He's seeing it in different fields, but the truth is that quantum mechanics provides another avenue of general revelation, which is great. The difference, though, is that, like, general revelation and specific revelation, which is the unveiling of God as who he is, as according to the scriptures, and specifically through the incarnation of Jesus Christ, like, that transcends general revelation, and that clarifies not just God is kind of like this, which is, sure, we can get some of those layers from nature. Specific revelation is like, this is who God is, and this is his plan for the world, and this is how you get into the kingdom of God. Like, those things aren't really things that you can get through general revelation. And so, when I'm thinking about things like sound and light and all of this, to sort of go back to what you were saying, Ken, and the fact that there's all kinds of conversation and analogy about that, again, if we're looking at this to the idea of general revelation, like, yeah, there's a lot of times where, like, God is light, scripture just kind of straight up says it that way. Does that mean that God is photons? No, that's not what that means, right? Like, but it's kind of silly to think that that is the case, right? But what's,
you know what? If we were to say that, because photons are part of the created order, remember, God created light. Photons are we'll say, subparticles of light. God is not his creation. If we go there, we are pantheists. Or we're panentheists. He's discovering himself through his creation. It's either one or the other. Both are heresy classically. And again, part of the crisis that we're having on the right end of the church, not the left end of the church. I'm speaking now not right and wrong, but theologically right, theologically left. Part of the crisis we're having on the right end of the church in charismatic and evangelical theology is this desire to go right there. And little did we know we were stumbling into the errors of pantheism, panentheism.
Yeah. Hold on. Here's one note there
too. If we want to think about it, I mean, I've heard people on both spectrums. I mean, honestly, this week, from people that I know who are looking to the universe, and they're grafting that in with Christianity and astrology, and saying, well, God made the stars; He's in the stars, so this can help direct. So someone's doing that right now that my wife and I just talked about. We say, I can't believe that, because that's not traditional Christianity. And then you have, on the other hand, people that are saying Christ is in all things, right? So Christ is in this tree. And I've heard people say Christ is in my dog. And it's like, well, no, Christ is a person, is Jesus. And as far as I know, Jesus is still in his body, his resurrected body. And typically he stays on the throne. So, there's a difference. And so we're taking these things, these small statements, and like you're saying, I love that idea of saying we're looking at these thumbprints to sort of build back on, instead of having it point to revelation. And so yes, things are like that, but specifically, Jesus is a person, an embodied, an embodiment, and where he is, instead of being in my dog. Christ is in all things.
Right. And I think when we, another mistake that we can do, because we are in such a scientifically saturated culture, is when we read the scriptures, we can project the materialistic scientific expectation that we have of the world back onto the scriptures. And we can say, okay, when God said, let there be light, we can try and analyze that said through our 21st century understanding of sound and sound waves. But I'm quite sure that what the Hebrews were thinking when they read and wrote that was not a physical phenomenon. Like before God create, sound requires a gas to propagate through. Sound exists as a wave of changing pressure within a medium. When God says, things that create things before there is a medium for sound waves to travel in, it's really anachronistic of us to read the scripture and say, oh, it must be talking about the physics of sound. It must be talking about the physics of light. That's not what's happening in the biblical author's mind or the biblical reader's minds in their original contexts. And so we have to be careful when we do that. Once again, there may be some interesting things there, but we are doing analog type reasoning. This is an analogy. This is not a literalism. And that's one of those things that I feel like I often see people cross that line back and forth and not realize it. I'm treating this literally when it wasn't meant to be treated in that way. Our physical mechanistic worldview was not what the biblical writers had. So if we think that's what they were writing, then that's actually on us.
No, that's so good. And having someone, you just explained sound. I don't know how sound works, but that makes sense. Of course it's not the same kind of sound. And so we do want to part of the goal of this podcast and things that Ken talks about and that I try to talk about, you try to talk about is integrity of the scriptures and trying to be as true to the scriptures as possible. And I mean, I've heard you talk about worldview in your School of Kingdom Ministry. And so it is interesting, isn't it, that we're putting on this modern pseudoscientific worldview.
Right.
Being of ancient Hebraic scripture.
Right. And that's not to say, by the way, that it is by accident that the scriptures are framing it as God said, let there be light. There's meaning to that phrase. It's just the meaning is not the meaning of 21st century scientific analysis. And so if we want to understand what that means, we have to look at what does speaking mean in the ancient world? What would it mean for an authority to speak in the ancient world? What are the dynamics that are in play in their understanding? And all of that is fair game. But what's not fair game is to take our now scientific understanding of these things and project it back into that context.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's important, and that's causing me right now to even rethink how I'm seeing things, because I think we just do that just naturally, right? And just the same way that we're seeing things through a Western worldview or whatever, I think that's even more of a point to that, right? That because we have some sort of a basis in science. I think that's really important for us all to think.
So when it comes to so sometimes people ask me, so bottom line, Putty, what with your understanding of quantum mechanics and what lesson do you learn from all of your study as it comes to the things of the supernatural, which is what people are trying to really ask. They're trying to say, this is all interesting and the supernatural stuff is important. And there's clearly some sort of resonance between the two somehow. What is it that I should take away from that? And what I'll often tell people is I'll say, look, this is how I process it. Okay. What quantum mechanics does absolutely concretely reveal to us as a scientifically proven statement is that it is possible in our created reality for there to be a world that behaves entirely differently to the world that we live in, that's sitting right underneath our noses and is something that is completely hidden to us, yet nevertheless is scientifically provable and can even be harnessed to create our lasers and DVD players and satellites and all the things it's given us, computers, etc.
Wow.
If that is the case, how much more plausible does it seem to me that there would be a hidden spiritual reality that operates according to very different rules than our natural reality, but nevertheless is 100% real and true and affects the way that our present world works. If science has proven an exact parallel that has so many qualities in place, and it is scientifically demonstrated over and over and over again, to me, it does not then seem a stretch that the scriptures would articulate a spiritual reality that has many of the same qualities. That is a scientifically bulletproof statement. That, totally fair game. You can totally go there. But once you go beyond that, you're probably crisscrossing disciplines and getting into fuzzy waters.
That's awesome. We probably don't have time on this episode. We definitely want to have you back. But I would love to talk about, how did you hold on to your faith in that world? Because constantly, I think the false narrative is that, well, you only believe in the spiritual, the supernatural, or even, a God because you just don't know enough.
Sure.
And you know what I mean? And so, and you know a lot about, and particularly in science. And, I would just find that maybe you can come back and we'll have that conversation too, because I think being able to see someone that can hold science in one hand and continue to hold on to not just God, but supernatural God.
Right.
In another hand is
right.
You need to hear more of that.
Yeah. Well, I can.
Go ahead. Go on. I don't want to cut you off. Go ahead.
I was gonna say I can open that up briefly if you'd like. We could certainly have a longer conversation. I'll say two things I think with respect to that. The first is my experience, believe it or not, of the top tier of the scientific community was that it was not a hostile anti-God group of people that I expected it to be. In fact, my experience was that as I worked my way up through science, it got hostile and anti-God and, all of this. And then once I actually broke through to the scientists, like the people actually doing the science and not just like the people who come after them and write the textbooks and have an axe to grind, I actually found the scientists themselves remarkably open to faith. Many of them had faith themselves. Many of them respected my faith. I don't think I ever actually had one instance where people intimated that I must be an idiot because I believed in these things. In fact, more often than not, I felt a considerable amount of respect. Now, that could be somewhat discipline related. My guess would be is that not every discipline is as open-minded. Particularly, I would guess that biology is probably far more antagonistic. But so actually, believe it or not, that was my experience. Although it is still, there definitely were still challenges with respect to the fact that living in a world that is defined by the fact that it only accepts a natural worldview does present layers to navigate, even if people aren't hostile and attacking you.
Sure.
But I think what I would say is, you highlighted something, Grant, that I think is really important and is a subtle thing that we don't necessarily always realize, which is this. Is it a good reason to believe in God because there are things that you don't understand in the world? Like, is that, if that's the reason we believe in God, is that really actually a good reason to believe in God? And I think that's a really important question to ask. Because for a very, very long time in human history, like, God sort of became the default explainer. Well, I don't know what that is, but that's God. I don't know what that is, but that's God. And then what happens is, of course, science explains a lot of stuff, and then a bunch of people deconvert. And I think, to me, as I read that, and I look at that history, to me, what that says is that, like, well, maybe there's a better reason to believe in God than just there are things I don't understand. Like, that's kind of a dumb reason to believe in God, if that makes sense. Or it's dumb that that's the only reason I would believe in God. Maybe that's what I'm actually trying to say. I think if that's the only reason we believe in God, we're probably living in a conspicuous space that could collapse really at any moment.
Yeah,
So,
no, that's good.
Ken, you were gonna say something, I thought.
Yeah, I was gonna was going to ask another question just before we wrap this up, which almost seems like a strange one, but here we go. Do you think there is a place, people talk about the 7 mountains. Do you think there is a place for Christians who are hardcore, sold out scientists in today's world to pursue this as a calling? Maybe not unlike Isaac Newton did, or, even Einstein famously said, God does not play dice with the universe.
Sure.
And when I was at Princeton, there was an astrophysicist there named Don York. He got recruited away from Princeton to the University of Chicago and ultimately retired from there. But I've known some people like this, but do you think the world has changed enough that there's no longer such a place? Or do you think we have perhaps some listeners on this show who have been fighting this, thinking their devotion to Jesus somehow, abnegates the need or the calling that they might be feeling? What does that look like? How does that feel? Because for you, you're a scientist. You're now in the ministry. You went towards the ministry in the end, but you were a believer when you were studying all this. And Grant asked the question, how did you not lose your faith? And I postulate that we need not a few, but perhaps hundreds of deeply Christian scientists who can hold their own against the Stephen Hawkings of the world, right, and articulate a God-centric view of physics and cosmology. But again, you're far better qualified to say this than I am. So yeah. I want to turn you loose to speak into that for those who may feel that calling.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Ken. That's excellent. Yeah, I think maybe this is a very strong way to say it, but I would almost even say, well, hold on. I'm pretty sure science belongs to believers. Like, in the sense that, look, if God made this all, then looking at the way God made it is a deeply important activity of faith. And if we think this is all some random accident, then what's the point in studying it other than it's interesting? But if God made it, and, I think of the proverb that says, it's the glory of kings to search out a matter. It's the glory of kings to search out the way that God made the universe. And we actually have a reason to undertake that study that a non-Christian scientist does not have. And so I would say, absolutely, I think there's a place. I think the world needs it. I don't think it is incompatible with our faith at all. I think it actually flows really clearly and cleanly with our faith. And I think that, I think God will meet you there. Yes, God did call me out of physics, but it wasn't because something was wrong with physics by any means. And in fact, I had so many instances where, getting a PhD in physics is it's like this. It's like someone puts you in a dark room and they shut off all the lights and they give you a baseball bat and they say, there's a lamp somewhere in this room. Tell me something about it. And you have to swing around the room blindly with a baseball bat. You can't see anything until you eventually smash into something, and then you pick up all the pieces and try and learn something. That's the experience of science. You're stumbling around in the dark. And there were so many instances in my studies, in my thesis, and all of the things I did, where I would just hit a wall and I would be like, I cannot, I have no idea what to do here. And I would throw everything I would have at it. And then eventually I'd just give up and I'd be like, all right, God, I'm done. I give up, whatever. I would go to bed. I would have a dream that night and I would wake up with the dream having told me where to keep going. And I would search down that path and be able to keep moving forward. My experience of science was that the Holy Spirit was in the process helping it move along.
I just have to interrupt here. That's fascinating because I've never asked you this question before, but have you ever seen the movie called The Man Who Saw Infinity?
Is that the one about Ramanujan?
Yeah, that's the one.
Great movie. Yeah.
Yeah. So, he was a Hindu, so I'm not in any way endorsing Hinduism here, but it's fascinating that he understood the solution to that problem because he had a dream just like you're describing. And I might add, Sergey Brin got the idea for Google in a dream while he was at Stanford University. You're in a very rarefied class here, Putty. I don't know. Maybe you're going to be the next Einstein. Who knows?
No. Let's clarify. It's only famous people that you know about their dreams, but I think but yeah, no, I mean, Raman Nugent's a fascinating story. And actually, if you study him a little deeper, Ken, you'll find this very interesting. He believed that one of the Hindu gods came to him and told him the mathematical formulas. He actually ascribed a spirituality to it, and he had like a name for the deity and whatever. And I actually think that there's probably like a reality to that. I think there was some spirit that was like helping him intuit all this stuff or something, because he was one of these people where, you know, in science and in mathematics, sometimes they talk about people who, there's different levels of geniuses. And one type of genius, they say, is like someone who's much like all the rest of us. They're just better. They're just really good. Like, you know, like they're just, they connect all the dots or whatever. And they said, there's another kind of genius, which like, you just like can't draw any line from normal people to that person. Like their mind just works entirely differently. They used to say this about Richard Feynman. I'm sure you know who Feynman is.
Yeah, Feynman Hall at Princeton. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. They used to say, I'm convinced that Feynman is a personal friend of the electron. That's what they would say, because they'd be like, what's going to happen here? And Feynman would just look at it and he would be like, here's what's going to happen. And they'd be like, how do you even know that? Like, you didn't do any formulas or whatever. He's like, I just know. Like, there's people that just kind of like have this ability to almost conjure up the things. And I actually think the spiritual world is probably involved with that. And so I think Raman Nugent probably did have a spirit, and my guess would be not one of the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just to be clear. But you know, I don't know. There's interesting things happening there. So.
Well, and theoretically, if the creator, if we're in contact with him, we might have a leg up in science. Wouldn't you think? Because he kind of made it all.
I sure hope so. So to answer your question, though, in brief, Ken, yes, absolutely. There's space for that. I would say we need it. I don't think we can afford to surrender science to a league of entirely unbelievers. Like, the reality is science is the religion of our 21st century.
I agree. Yeah.
It's the common religion. And if we don't have people of faith in the middle of that, working to seed the kingdom in that, to be the leaven in the lump, then I think we are making a grave mistake.
Absolutely agree with you. Yeah. And in fact, we've been kind of in a very defensive posture in conservative Christianity for about a century since the Scopes monkey trial. And I don't want to get into a discussion about evolution or anything like that right now. That would certainly blow us out of our time boundaries. But I think, you know, in the aftermath of that, even though you could say we won, we actually lost. And since that time, there have been not many, but there have been a few, what I would call, you know, top level scientists and thinkers, whether it's in the hard sciences or the biological sciences. There have not been many, only a few, and not enough to really, I would say, change the conversation. Mm-hmm. And I want to be careful even the language that I use there. Change the conversation. I mean, yes, I think we should be influencing it, but you know, one of the things I learned a while back from multiple mentors, actually, and I'm very grateful that I had mentors who thought and they articulated it this way. They always said, we seek the truth, no matter where it leads. But we must test what we think is the truth to be sure that it is really the truth, because there are false realities out there. And I think there are many of them that are in play in our world today. They may be scientific, they may be political, they may be, well, many things, but people buy into them, not having tested them, and they presume them to be right, or they want them to be right. And so they conveniently omit information that doesn't fit the presumptive hypothesis of the moment that they're trying to prove. And that's not how good science is done either. In good science, you say, wait a minute, this is disconfirming evidence. We need to do something with this. It might blow up my entire theory, but okay, if that's what happens, that's what happens. Right. we have all kinds of things going on today where people just sort of, yeah. I don't see it. I don't hear it. I don't care. This is the answer. And there are multiple spheres in which that occurs. So I really think we need Christians who are mentally tough and resilient, who are willing to go into these fields because they love this stuff. They love science. They love matter. They love the nature of how DNA reproduces. And they have a God-centric view of the universe, but they bring that to bear in such a way that their research is no longer hostile to or ambivalent toward, those aren't the same, the things of God. They allow that overarching truth to guide them. I think that's really where we want to be. But I can say I see precious little of this in the renewal streams of the church. Precious little.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think that's entirely true. And there's some kind of a underpinning, it feels to me, in the sort of charismatic renewal space, which actually would almost pit intelligence against spiritual maturity. I can't even tell you how bad I felt for so long for like not being able to just check my brain off and like go with stuff that like, well, it's the Holy Spirit. Like, you don't have to understand, like, just whatever. Like, what are you, not a person of faith? Like, and like, I felt terrible about that for like years. Like, I'm not joking at all. And like, I think that's actually on us. Like, if that's the culture we're creating, then like, yeah, we're not going to have those people.
Does that mean that all those people were intelliphobes? Or is the other word for that smart shaming?
Yeah, there was a bit of that. Well, I'll tell you what though. You know what it was? Eventually I had a conversation with the Lord about that. And this was all happening while I was still in physics. I'd met the Holy Spirit. I'm still in physics. I'm navigating all of this, and like for me, what a lot of it manifested is like I couldn't do something unless I could do it with integrity. I wasn't trying to be closed or judgmental. I just needed to have enough understanding of something that I could do it with integrity and not just like check my brain at the door. But that was often interpreted as being closed-minded or judgmental or whatever. And I did have some of that, but the Lord got me over that. And I was then kind of on the other side of that journey. And I remember having a conversation with God one day, and I said, God, I feel like it's not fair. Like, you're the one who gave me this brain, and now I'm doomed to be like a bad Christian because of the brain that you gave me. Like, I'm supposed to just like forget who I am and like act like something else. That doesn't seem fair, God. Like, what gives? Like, what am I missing here? That doesn't seem like you. And it was one of those moments where I'm sure you guys both know what I'm talking about, where sometimes the Lord speaks and it's just like really clear. It's not always like that for me. There's many times where I'm like, oh, was that Lord? I don't know, we'll try it, whatever. But sometimes it was just like, bang, crystal clear. And this was one of those times. And the Lord was like, he's like, Putty, he's like, I want you to look at Peter and I want you to look at Paul. I'm like, okay. And he's like, look, Peter was an idiot. Peter was stupid. like Peter did not have a brain. Peter didn't have a brain to check at the door. And he's like, but Paul was brilliant. Paul was studied. Paul went to the Harvard of the Jewish, thing, as we all well know, like he was incredibly studied. And because of that, like, yeah, it took a little bit longer and a little more work for Jesus to get through to Paul. And I was like, okay, yeah, I'm following. And he said, look, here's the deal, Putty. I needed Peter on the day of Pentecost because sometimes something happens and you need someone who doesn't need to understand it, who can just jump up and say, I don't really get it, but I know it's Jesus, repent and believe. and 3,000 people get saved, and it's absolutely incredible. It's amazing. He's like, I needed Peter for that moment. Paul probably wouldn't have worked in that moment. Paul would have been like, oh man, and he's like analyzing all the scriptures and all this. It's like, that wouldn't work. He said, but how many books of the Bible did Peter write? And I was like, 2. It's like, how many did Paul write? I was like, oh, I don't know, like 12, 14, something like that. And I felt like the Lord said, look, I needed Peter to be Peter in this moment. I needed Paul to be Paul in that moment. It's not a matter of good or bad. It's a matter of different things are needed. I'm going to work with all of you to do what I need you to do. Just let yourself be who you are. And for me, that was really powerful and really freeing. And it would be my prayer that anyone who's in the renewal space, who is like, I mean, truthfully, like us, Ken, we're both kind of wired this way, where our mind is like, wants to analyze, wants to understand. And it's not out of a bad place. It's actually out of a search for truth, which is awesome. If that's you, God made you that way. Like, receive it, and it will actually bless more people when you do. Like, how many letters, or how many people has Paul's letters blessed? So many, massively. Walk the journey. It'll be worth it.
Right.
No, I agree.
Place to close.
It's so cool to have you both here, because honestly, as for me, when we planted a church in Nashville, we had a lot of people. We were the least charismatic church in the world, and we had a lot of people come, but they were very smart, very intelligent, and very suspect of crazy charismatic stuff and being weird for weird's sake. And it was the two of you actually that we were able to introduce, Putty through the School of Kingdom Ministry and Ken through you coming, your intelligence, your background, and how that you interwove the scripture. You stay very true to the scripture. You don't get weird on purpose, and you keep things grounded. And for us, it was the thing that helped pull the people in our church to be okay with, like, okay, I don't have to be weird on purpose. I don't have to check my brain at the door. I mean, we had PhDs from Vanderbilt. And so, you know, they were having to figure out, like, can I be this and still be smart? And you guys actually were the things that helped pull them too. So for me, this is a really fun time and conversation, because I'm an idiot, and I'm the people.
I would not say that, but okay.
in this scenario, and so like for me, I was like, why are you doing this, Lord? Why are you calling me to this? And he's like, well, sometimes I just need somebody dumb enough to keep doing it. So I was like, okay, that's me. But so for me, this is a really fun time, and just want to thank you guys both for doing this and for doing what you do, and for holding on to that integrity of saying, like, no, we can be smart and still be all into the things of the Spirit. And it allows a lot of people to put their toe in the water that may or not have. And God, send the charismatic movement more smart Christians. Let's just pray for that, and we'll keep doing that today. I think that's a great way to close. Ken, Putty, thank you guys so much for joining us. And Putty, we want to have you back. There's so many more things that we want to get into. So we'll have you back, and look forward to it. So thank you guys so much for joining us.
Always great to do these, Grant, with you. And Putty, thanks for coming on the show, and we'll have you back soon.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's been a blast, and I can't wait.
All right.